John Bevis is our expert on found poetry, so I'll hand it over to Lauren.
Great, thank you very much, Margaret. And I will just try to get this technology going, and I'll share my screen, which you should see in 3, 2, 1, boom. And now, can someone tell me if you can see this?
Yes, perfect.
Okay, perfect. Okay, great. So without further ado, let's get started on what is clearly the fun event of 2021, our Found Poetry Workshop. So just a little bit of context. I am relatively new to found poetry. It was definitely a 2020 thing for me. I was exploring writing more poetry, and I started writing found poetry without knowing what it really was that I was doing. So once I was aware that this is actually a thing, found poetry, and I wanted to find out more about it, I, of course, like any good scholar, went straight to the internet, and was very disappointed in being able to find any good material, good information beyond Wikipedia about found poetry. And that's when I first encountered our special guest here tonight, John Bevis. I found his primer on found poetry, and it was perfect. It was exactly what I was looking for, full of, great information, historical references, basically the history and the future of found poetry. So that was definitely, the inspiration behind tonight's event. And when we started planning this workshop, I reached out to John on a whim and a prayer. I didn't think I was even going to get a response, but to my delight, not only did he respond, but he was also able to make it here tonight. So that's to get us started. Now, our poetic plan for this evening is, first of all, we are going to talk about found poetry. You won't be disappointed. We're going to talk about the types, techniques, examples, the history of found poetry into the future, basically all you need to know to get started and more in building your own found poetry practice and getting inspired. After that, we are going to do some found poem readings. John is going to read a selection of his found poetry work, giving us some context also around the poems, which I also always find supremely interesting with found poetry, is tracking back where the ideas came from and what the sources were. And I will attempt to follow John with a couple of poems of my own. And then finally, once we're all done with that, we are going to do a found poetry writing exercise. So for 15 minutes, you will be set loose upon your house to find what inspiration that you can to put together a short found poem, or long, depending on what you can do in 15 minutes. And John is going to judge a just for fun winner for us. And then, as Margaret was saying earlier, then we're going to move into our regular, normal open mic after that, and then our session will end. Now, so first up, a bit more about John Bevis. So he was born in Guildford in the UK and now lives in Shropshire, which is a beautiful name of a place, I have to say. And he has worked basically everywhere in the field, from being an author, proofreader, typesetter, printer, and publisher. And he particularly loves working with artist books and small presses. If you're interested in John, which I'm sure you will be, particularly after this session, on this slide you can find some links to some of his work, and this PDF, a PDF of this presentation, will be sent around to everyone who's on our subscribe list after the event. So make sure that your name is on that if you want to receive a copy of this. So here, John, there's links to 3 pieces of John's work. Some Alternatives to Flock contains some of his found poetry. Leatherwing Kite is poetry which creates poems out of the common names of birds. And also he's very interested in writing about nature. So you can check out the Kierton's Inventing Nature photography book if that's what you're interested in. And I was hoping, John, you might want to say a couple of words and introduce yourself to the group at the minute.
Sure. Yeah. Good evening, everybody. I think the thing I would start with is just how and why I got into found poetry, what it was about it, and the poetry that I was reading early on. This was like mid-1970s. Was concrete poets like Ian Hamilton Finlay, sound poets like Bob Cobbing. More lyrical minimalist poets like Thomas A. Clarke, Simon Cutts. And these were all poets who ran their own presses, printed their own works. And so there was an entirety to what they were doing. And they were all also doing a lot of found poetry, and I was curious about that. And yet I found it somehow seemed absolutely appropriate and fitting that there was something instinctively right about it. And I was trying to work out what that was, and the lyrics of a song by The Fall came to me that was out about that same time. He thinks he is more interesting than the world, but buying cigarettes puts him in the world. And the reason I made that link was that in found poetry you have that transaction with the world, transaction with existing stuff. You negotiate with what's already there, and somehow that can feel to me more real and more grounded than dealing with whatever it is that comes out of the top of your head, all that psychological garbage you have to sift through to get the gems. So that's my starting point. Okay. Great,
thanks, John. And we'll be hearing loads more from John later, so don't worry, it won't be just my voice you'll be tortured with this evening. And very generously, John has offered a copy of the primer that I was talking about, John's primer of found poetry, a copy for everybody who wants one, who's here tonight. So if your email address is not already on our list, then all you need to do is send a private message to Margaret, who introduced us at the start, with your email address, and she'll make sure that it's put on the list. Okay, so just a little bit about me. You kind of know already, I am Lauren O'Donovan. I am a Cork poet, UCC student. Some of my partners in crime from the creative writing course up at UCC are here tonight, so hello to everybody. I am a helper with DeBarra's putting on these sessions, which I love doing. And of course, I'm a found poetry lover, and that is one of the reasons why we are all here today. And as much as I would like to take credit for everything, I unfortunately can't, because there's a really big, awesome team behind the DeBarra's events. Some of them are on the call with us as well this evening. You know, we've got Nick, Mose, Paul, Margaret, Catherine, and Stan. So let's start off with a very simple definition. What is found poetry? And most simply, a found poem is one which contains found elements. And by found elements, we mean text discovered in our environment, and could be absolutely any text in our environment. So again, a found poem is one that contains some sort of text that we have discovered in our environment, and then we've reframed it as a poem. A popular definition that you'll come across a lot online is that found poetry is the literary equivalent of collage. So I think that's kind of a nice way of getting your mind to start thinking about it, and to have that visual example of collage. And getting into a bit more of a defined definition, this is from Wiki, more or less, with some edits. But found poetry is a type of poetry created by taking words, phrases, and sometimes whole passages from other sources and reframing them, often by making changes, say in spacing, lines, or maybe by adding or deleting text, thus imparting new meaning. And the resulting poem can be defined as either adapted, which would be changed in a profound manner, or intact, which would be virtually unchanged. And don't worry too much about those definitions right now, because we're going to dive into those in depth in a little while. Now, because visuals, you know what they say about pictures, so just to get our mind focused with a couple of visual examples of found poetry. This is a favorite of mine. It is book spine found poetry, and you know, obviously it's a favorite of librarians. They have great fun with this, and basically the idea here is that you take the titles of the book and arrange the books in such a way that they read as a poem. So this one says, after you talk to me, everything sings, everything is illuminated, instant love. And the next example that we have here is called Blackout, or sometimes you'll hear it called erasure found poetry. So here you have a page of text, and the poet has selected certain words and then blacked out, or sometimes erased, all of the other words to make a new piece. So this piece reads, Luke Perry calls, Mr. Rogers' voicemail, not to add to the messages, but to listen to the voice. And there was actually an article recently on NY Times about Blackout or erasure poetry, about encouraging people to do this. I suppose found poetry has become a popular pastime in lockdown days. So we're very on topic. You know, if NY Times are all over it, then we're certainly very on trend tonight. Here's an example of artistic found poetry. So there's just, you know, even with all the examples provided in this presentation tonight, there are, you know, it is imagination is your limit with found poetry. And I think that this is a pretty cool visual way if you're both poetically inclined and artistically inclined. One way that you can combine the other is to actually make art from the poem and make art from words. It's not the most common form of found poetry or the easiest, but it certainly is beautiful when you see examples. And this is an example of cutout selected found poetry. And you'll have to forgive the photography here. This is actually John's primer and my kitchen table. So I just wanted to take a quick shot so you get the idea of what this looks like. But this has been a pretty popular method and other alterations of the idea is that you're using a little cardboard window and running it over text to see selections or to see, you know, groups of words that sort of pop that might, you know, inspire the poet. I've also seen or heard people using like a Stanley knife, like a scalpel, to say remove paragraphs of text in a book or a newspaper article, to, you know, show up text that is behind that, and the combinations of all these cutouts or selections can have some serendipitous, you know, word selections or choices that then lead to a poem. I think somebody was actually telling me that one or more of those techniques was actually used by David Bowie in order to write some of his song lyrics, which I thought was very interesting. And now, as to that's kind of the definition and some examples of found poetry, but what is the point of found poetry? And I think that John has a great you know, quote in his primer about that, which is, satisfaction comes from spotting some hitherto unsuspected poetic quality in a piece of text and revealing it to popular amusement or amazement. So I think we'll be seeing, you know, that's good to keep in mind as we move through some of the examples, where you can see that, you know, one piece of text is taken or moved into a different space where new meanings are revealed, you know, to, as John says, to amusement or amazement. So a brief history of found poetry, very brief, but basically the principal idea of incorporating one piece of text into another piece of text is probably as old as the art of writing itself. It's impossible to source when that first happened. But in relation to found poetry, one certain point of reference we have is in the 16th century with macaronics. And what was done here was words, so modern words paired with Latin endings were introduced into Latin verse so as to produce a sort of ridiculous, satirical, humorous effect. And the term was coined by the founder, Teofilo, and he was a wandering Benedictine monk. And I believe from John's primer, he actually made his living from these macaronics at the time. I feel like macaronics are still something that we could probably get away with today. It would be interesting to try one. And some of the earliest standalone found poems that we can trace back are by the French poet Blaise Sandars. And this is a telegram poem taken from the Paris Midi, which was in January in 1914. So this is going back quite a ways. And I was hoping, John, if you were there, you have a lovely reading voice. I was hoping maybe you would humor me by reading out this one.
Sure, absolutely. Let's have a go. Oklahoma, 20th of January, 1914. 3 convicts possessed themselves of revolvers, killed their warder and seized the keys of the prison, burst out of their cells and killed 4 guards in the courtyard. Then they seized the prison's young stenographer, and getting into a vehicle which was waiting at the gate, departed at high speed, while the guards fired their revolvers at the fugitives. Some guards leapt on horseback and went in pursuit of the fugitives. Shots were exchanged on both sides. The girl was wounded by a shot from one of the guards. A bullet killed the horse which was drawing the vehicle. The guards were able to come up. They found the convicts dead, their bodies riddled with bullets. Mr. Thomas, former congressman, who was visiting the prison, congratulated the girl. Okay.
Great, thanks, John. And it's so funny. This is the poem is over 100 years ago, but it still seems, you know, quite so modern, really. So now just getting into a little bit of 20th century philosophy, which is applicable to, you know, 20th century found poetry. Why did it start to resonate? Where did it come from, you know, since the 16th century? So in the 20th century, there was a couple of philosophical movements that really affected the popularity of found poetry. So Dadaism was one of them. It was an art movement and a definite predecessor for found poetry. So Dadists like Duchamp placed everyday practical objects in an environment that was aesthetic. And the reason that they were doing this was to call into question art itself, basically, to call into question that object as art, the observer, the aesthetic environment, you know, the definition of art. So you can kind of, you know, clearly already see some links between that, even with aesthetic art, to found poetry. And Dadaism was developed in reaction to World War I. And basically they were rejecting sort of logic, reason, the old ways of doing things, and instead expressing, you know, nonsense, irrationality, anti-bourgeois protest in their works, just trying to challenge things, question things. And this movement spanned, you know, all the artistic areas, visual, literary, sound. And also links in is also very familiar to us, you know, with modernism as well. You know, modernism also happened in response or around the time after World War I, and was inspired by a lot of the same things, really. You know, was this wanting to get a break from the past and looking forward to a new future, a different form of future, different forms of art, different forms of expression. So when we get into the 20th century found poetry, looking at some very significant poets, you know, started to incorporate, you know, snippets of found texts into larger poems. And, you know, definitely really these were some, you know, big, you know, found poems of the time, maybe not defined as such at the time, but certainly when we look back with their definition, they definitely are category, you know, they definitely fall into the definition of found poetry. So Ezra Pound's Cantos is an example, which includes letters written by presidents and popes and loads of official documents from governments and banks. The Wasteland by T.S. Eliot references and uses lines from so many texts that you honestly could not even list them all, I don't think. And a lot of other poets were kind of in the same camp as Pound and Eliot. And we're going to look at some of those later as well, specifically William Carlos Williams. And moving from the 20th century into the 21st century up until where we are today, you know, found poetry has gotten a lot more popular and has really even penetrated sort of popular movements where people might not even realize what it is that they're listening to or looking at is found poetry. So Dave Gorman is a good example of this. He's a comedian that, God, it could be, it could be 15, nearly 20 years ago now, even though in my mind it feels like 5 or 10, but he was a comedian who compiled found poems from internet comments, and he included these in his shows. All this stuff is still available on YouTube, and it is very funny if you want to go and check that out. Another example of found poetry popularity up in our time is that the Found Poetry Review that debuted in 2011. And so completely dedicated to found poetry, a quarterly journal, and has included all sorts of stuff, you know, from etiquette books, wiki articles, you know, AOL search data. As I said, imagination really is the only limit. And my personal favorite example right now is this guy, Lubalin, who has gone viral with a couple of his videos on TikToks. And he is kind of doing something similar to Dave Gorman, but putting it into songs. So he's taking hilarious comment conversations online and without changing them, is putting them into these kind of dramatic songs. And Yeah, he's gotten very popular, very famous for this recently. So yeah, if you happen to have TikTok or even YouTube, I definitely recommend checking that out because it is truly hilarious stuff. So some questions to consider as we move forward in the presentation. Hopefully we'll have answered most, if not all, by the time that we get to the end. But first up, what sources can be exploited to make found poetry? What are legitimate sources for found poetry? How are we to select the text to become found poetry? Can the words be left as they are? Must we change them in some way for originality or uniqueness, for plagiarism? Can the original meaning be preserved, or must a new meaning be sought? And are we discovering poetic qualities in these poems, or are we endowing poetic qualities? And how can the quality of found poetry be assessed? So now, here we have types of found poem. So we've got three main categories that you can sort the vast majority of found poems into. So we've got three of them. The first one is intact text, the second is selected text, and the third is adapted text. For intact text, the original text is retained whole. For selected text, what we're doing there is taking words or phrases selected randomly or deliberately from maybe a single source or maybe multiple sources. And for an adapted text, we're mixing up found material with creative thinking and creative writing. Now, don't get too in the weeds with these definitions right now. We're going to walk through each one of them individually, and hopefully they'll come to life much more clearly in your mind. So the first up, intact found poetry. And the example we have here is one by the late American poet, Jonathan Williams. It's Eat 300 Feet. And the context of that poem is he saw it on a road sign. So you can imagine if you did see with your driver hat on driving, if you saw this on a sign, Eat 300 feet, you would know that that meant in 300 feet there was going to be a restaurant or some sort of pit stop for you. But what Jonathan has done is he's taken that road sign out of the context of the road sign and put it into a poetic context. And now suddenly it reads quite a bit differently. You know, reading it, this very short poem, you might have some really strange, surrealist mental images coming to you about having to eat 300 feet. So this one is a great example of an intact found poem. He did not change anything. He just took the text from one context and just moved it into another. Now, so opponents of found poetry dislike this type of found poetry the most because they cite plagiarism. But the legitimate intact found poem, one that is not plagiarism, you're not just getting somebody else's poem and putting your name on it. What it does is it makes us read with the sensibility of a poet. It makes us aware of hidden or unintended virtues in text that maybe were always there, but we weren't able to see it until somebody noticed them and took them out and put them into a poetic context. And John has a lot more examples and subsets on intact found poetry in his primer. So if you're interested, I would definitely recommend you follow up and check those out in the primer. Next up, we have selected text found poetry. So this is the one where we have words or phrases or both selected randomly or deliberately from single or multiple sources. That's a little bit wordy, but let's break it down. So on the right, you can see two examples. You've got a cutout poem and you've got a blackout poem or an erasure poem. In the cutout, you can see all the phrases or the words that have been cut out from different sources, multiple sources, and you know they're arranged. They were then arranged into a poem. And in the blackout, you see that there's been a page taken and then you know, words taken away to reveal the poem left beneath. So those are two examples of selected text found poems. So selected text found poems explore the potential of what one has been dealt with self-imposed rules. So I thought this was really interesting because when I first started writing found poetry, when I didn't really know what I was doing or that there was you know, much of a history or rules or anything to do with it, one of my early ones was to take the transcript of one of the recent presidential debates with Trump and Biden and just take that transcript, and I wanted to make a poem out of it. but I didn't want to change any words. And for some reason, it felt really important to me that I didn't change the order of the words, that I didn't add any words, that I would only take away words. It just felt right to me that those were the rules for this poem. Nobody was giving me these rules, but that just is what just felt right and felt natural for that particular form. And I was very interested to find out that a lot of people also feel similarly with these completely arbitrary self-imposed rules, but they just feel right in this particular type of found poetry. And I suppose in some ways that's the fun of it, is having these self-imposed rules that you're then playing your own game within to create something. So examples of how you could randomly select this text is, we were looking at the cardboard window, or, doing cutouts, like, like word clouds. Other methods include using dice, a blindfold and pin, using computer random generators. There are, endless ways to randomly select text. And in relation to deliberate selection, well, the blackout or the erasure is a great example of that, because you are very deliberately deleting those words. It's not random that those words are being deleted.
Video, I have you're using a computer audio.
And so the next, so selected text found poetry continued. So on the previous slide, we talked about, randomly or deliberately actually selecting the text. And now here we're talking a little bit more about from what sources. So sometimes this could be from a single source. Maybe all this text is from one news article, or maybe it's from multiple sources. Maybe it's from multiple news articles. Maybe it's from multiple different news sources. Maybe it's from a book and an instruction manual, it doesn't really matter. But it is worth noting that if you are using a single source, you're more likely to need more radical alterations to make your own unique thing out of that. Whereas when you're selecting from multiple sources, a certain amount of originality is already implied due to the fact of the selection that has gone in, the mixing up of these sources. So originality is a little bit easier when you're dealing with these, multiple sources. And, some quick ideas for you. We're going to do a challenge shortly enough. So where can you find some materials for this type of poetry? Well, as we said, newspaper articles are part of a book, an advert, that takeaway menu you have stuck on the fridge, maybe an email, Google search, washing machine instruction manual, absolutely anything with words in it is a candidate. And again, John, I was hoping that maybe you could read this poem here, The New Statesman, and on the following slide, there's another poem. So if you're up for it, I'd love if you would read those two.
Yeah, absolutely. Okay, so this was from a New Statesman competition, and every line in the poem is taken from a different source. Under a spreading chestnut tree, twice or thrice had I loved thee, but she is in her grave, and oh, wastes below, wastes below. I am quite sure she felt no pain. I wish I were in love again, my staff of faith to walk upon. Where have all the flowers gone? Let me to thy bosom fly, under the wide and starry sky, high as a flag on the 4th of July. She's the broad and I'm the high. So runs my dream, but what am I? Dig the grave and let me lie, and shall do till the last good night, an infant crying for the light.
Great, thank you very much. And just to reiterate again, so each one of those lines was a line from another poem, sources including, you can see down here, Longfellow and Donna and Wordsworth. So quite an original thing, even though, Peter didn't actually write any of the words himself, but he did select all of the lines and then recombine them into this new piece of work.
Okay, you wanted me to read this one too, didn't you, Laura?
Oh yeah, please,
yeah,
thank you.
Sure. Okay, the famous Donna Rumsfeld found poem. As we know, there are known knowns. These are things we know we know. We also know there are known unknowns. That is to say, we know there are some things we do not know. But there are also unknown unknowns the ones we don't know, we don't know.
Thanks very much, John. And I love in your primer, you know, you've got a much more of a discussion about this particular poem, especially in assessing the quality and the kind of uniqueness of it. I mean, I love it. It's so interesting and sort of satirical, I suppose. But, you know, I think as you point out in your primer, Hart Seeley didn't have to make very many changes or put much originality on top of Donald Rumsfeld's you know, quotes, because this was genuinely stuff that he was saying and would kind of come out this way. But I just thought it was another great example of selected text. Hart selected all these quotes by Donald and then arranged them into this piece of work. And for the third category, we've got adapted found poetry. So this is mixing up found material with creative thinking and creative writing. And at this point, you might say, well, how is that different to intact found poetry or selected found poetry, which you are taking found material and then obviously having to apply your creative thinking and your creative writing. But the difference with adapted found poetry is basically there is just a much, much greater change between the original found material and the end product, or the, you know, the context that the found material, if it is even a direct quote, is within, is in terms of a much larger original creative work that you yourself have made. So again, the emphasis on adapting and combining the text into significantly different contexts than maintaining the purity of the original. And again, John has loads more examples and subsets inside in the primer. But a great example of this is The Wasteland by T.S. Eliot. Like we have previously mentioned, you can see here on the right, the short list of some of the sources that Eliot either directly quotes or alludes to in The Wasteland, but you couldn't really accuse him of plagiarism or stealing any of their work or anything like that, because he takes their quotes or takes the allusions and places them together in such a new, different, unique piece of work, The Wasteland, you know, that it becomes its own thing. And that's really what we mean when we say adapted found poetry. Oh, and actually a good example of that was the London Bridge is falling down, falling down, falling down. So that you know, wasn't a direct quote from anyone famous, but just the or even he mentions, you know, the old Shakespearean rag inside The Wasteland as well. Those would have been popular sort of songs or even rhymes that were around at the time. So not only did he adapt, you know, famous texts, he also adapted, you know, the popular zeitgeist of the time as well into The Wasteland. And I'll read out this one because I just absolutely love it. But this is Just to Say by William Carlos Williams, and it's inspired by a note from his wife. And I love that because when I first read it, I had no context, and I was thinking this looks like a note that someone would leave on the fridge. So I was delighted to find that it is pretty much exactly that, or inspired by something like that. I have eaten the plums that were in the icebox, and which you were probably saving for breakfast. Forgive me, they were delicious, so sweet and so cold. And if you ever have a bored moment, then a great Google is This Is Just to Say parodies or satire. And I would say that this might be one of the most rewritten poems in history to hilarious effect. So again, if you're bored, definitely have a Google of that. So again, just to round up the types, hopefully that they're a little bit clearer now with a little bit of discussion on one or two examples. So we have the intact text. Here we had the Jonathan Williams poem, which was The Street Sign, Eat 300 Feet. So the original text is retained whole. With selected text, we had those words or phrases randomly or deliberately selected from maybe one source, maybe many sources. And some of the examples we had there were the cutout or the blackout or erasure poetry. And finally, we have the adapted text, you know, mixing up the found material with creative thinking and creative writing. So what's happening here is found elements are being taken and used, but they are placed in context of a much greater, you know, original work of the poet. And a good example there is The Wasteland by T.S. Eliot. Great, so we're moving through, getting to some final thoughts. Plagiarism, I think, is an important thing to talk about when we're talking about found poetry, because the primary criticism of found poetry is that it's basically just putting your own name onto essentially what is somebody else's work. Now, this isn't really an issue when the original has no intended literary merit, for example, a road sign. But, you know, it potentially is an issue when the original did have literary merit and what to do there. And in general, it is a gray area. Sometimes famous poets, they do cite their sources, and sometimes they do not acknowledge their sources. So, for example, we have the list of T.S. Eliot, but T.S. Eliot didn't provide that with the first publication of The Wasteland. It was through, you know, further writings and analysis by scholars, etc., that we got that full list of where T.S. Eliot draws all his pieces from. But in contrast, his contemporary, Marianne Moore, she is completely transparent and honest when she includes found elements. So ultimately, I definitely think this, and I know John thinks this from the primer, but common sense prevails at the end of the day. You know, use the rules of acknowledgement which apply to quotations in prose. If you are going to quote it in a prose and cite somebody, then also do that if you're going to include that in a poem. And you might be afraid or worried or just considering that including citations like that in a poem might take away from the poem. But I actually personally have found, and I know other found poets have found, and other readers, that context given to a found poem often actually adds to the story of the poem and not takes away, as you might be worried about, from appreciation of the piece. So I think I have myself personally begun to err very much on the side of, you know, giving more context and citing more sources than the opposite. I think it makes it more interesting to know that, you know, where the inspiration comes from. It ties it into the real world in a different kind of way. It's a different type of poem. So don't be afraid. When in doubt, cite, is what I say. And now you are all going to get a copy of this PDF. So if you are looking for some found poetry prompts or inspiration in the future, or you're even looking for some ideas for our exercise, which is up and coming, I'll just go through a couple of fun ideas if you're looking for inspiration. So you could take a book of Shakespeare or indeed any other writer or playwright. But here the example is to pick a single page of Romeo and Juliet and use that to compose a new love poem. Book blackout. So grab a page from your favorite book and scan it and copy it and print it out so you don't read your book, ruin your book, and then use that page to create a blackout poem or an erasure poem. So mashup muse. Why not write down lines from several of your favorite poems or songs or whatever and form a ballad. A ballad is a great, easy form of poetry. It's one of the oldest forms of poetry. So that kind of doubles down your difficulty there, having a found poem and then also putting it in the form of a ballad. Creative cut up. So you can cut up words and phrases from a newspaper page and try and form a haiku. And if you don't know much about haikus, then I know on the DeBarra's page, there should be our last workshop session with Anton Floyd, who did a great presentation and workshop about haiku. So if you wanted to, you could check that out there. E-poetry. So I know John has a good few examples of this in the primer as well, but you know, there is endless inspiration between search and everything on the internet, social, for funny poems, or just endless inspiration. You can use Google search predictions or search anything and then click the I feel lucky button and use whatever page you land on to try and make a poem out of. And finally, spam satire is actually poetic journals purely devoted just to satire. So you could take a deep dive into your email spam folder and try and make a spam poem, a spam found poem out of that. And if you're looking for further reading, well, absolutely start with the primer. Here are a number of well-known poets that incorporated found poetry into their works, and also John has a little bit, at least a little bit, about each one of these authors inside the primer as well. So again, that is that's your one-stop shop for further reading. Find out a little bit more about all of these guys in John's primer. Great, so that brings us right all the way to the end, where we are going to first have a reading from John, and then myself, and then we are going to have the writing exercise, and I will try and get out of sharing my screen so everyone can see each other again. Great, okay. Thank you all very much. And yeah, so John, if you would treat us with your reading, that would be absolutely fantastic.
Okay, thanks ever so much for that, Lauren. That was a really interesting introduction. Brilliant. I'm going to start off. This is one that I think is appropriate, given the difficulty I had getting into this meeting earlier this evening. This is from an email which was appeared in my inbox, and this is an example of the kind of poetry that you make from prose that accidentally scans. Your device is not compliant at the moment. Go to the sky portal to see the reason why your device is not compliant. This is a poem I always read whenever I do any found poetry reading. It was from one of the sources that Lauren was talking about just now, where you go on Google. There was a quote that I kind of half remembered, and I couldn't remember who said it in the first place, so I Googled it and got a lot of different results, and I sifted them out and put them together like this. Good artists borrow, great artists steal. Pablo Picasso. A bad writer borrows, a good writer steals. Mark Twain. It reminds me of a well-known quote by Handel. Good composers borrow, great composers steal. As Oscar Wilde said, or was it T.S. Eliot? Anyway, he said, good poets borrow, great poets steal. Good artists borrow, great artists steal, said Picasso or T.S. Eliot or Salvador Dali. No one seems to know which. I think it was Keith Richards who said, good artists borrow, great ones steal. Another idea for making a sound poem that Lauren mentioned was the book spine. This is a mixture of book titles and DVD titles from Amazon. Wake up with Whoopi Goldberg. Getting dressed with dignity. Breakfast with Osama bin Laden. Commuting with a toddler. Lunch with an astronaut. An afternoon with anxiety disorder. Tea with Mr. Rochester. A drink with Shane McGowan. Dancing with mathematics. Going home with Elvis. Supper with Dr. Crippen. Sleeping with cannibals. Okay, something I do is I'm interested in the headings you find in dictionaries, which gives you the first and last word on each page. And I collect those little pairs, which I quite like because they're kind of related because they're so close together in the alphabet. And you can do different things with them. This is an example of with a musical theme. Between beastly and bebop. Between cool and country. Between deadbeat and decadent. Between drumbeat and dub. Between jargon and jazz. Between jukebox and junk. Between harmony and havoc. Between rock and roll. I did a book last year which was comprised entirely of poems made up of the common English names of birds. Every species of bird in the world has a common English name. There are 10,500 odd of them. So I went through the list and started putting those names into little groupings that I found interesting. I'll read a couple of those. This first one I wrote with my granddaughters in mind. It's called Lullaby. Buffy tufted cheek, little bee eater, rosy pipit, Little button quail, blue noddy, spangled boobook, sooty swift, Zanzibar boo-boo, bagabo babbler, buffy hummingbird, speckled tinkerbird, Pringle's puffback, little button quail, rosy pipit, little bee eater, buffy tufted cheek. Here's another, this is a haiku from the same book. Red kite, canvasback, red knot, red-billed streamer tail, fly, river grass bird. And another one, this is something we haven't mentioned, that you can make found poems that are also sound poems. A lot of these bird names are from Hawaii, I believe. Akiki, Akipa, Akikiki, Akiopala'u, Kokako, Kakapo, Akohikohi, Okikokiko, Kama'o, Ke'a, Kaikukal, Kahau, Kagu, Karukohan. So another project I'm involved in at the moment is a book called Surrey Naturalist by Eric Parker. I'm from Surrey originally, and I didn't miss it when I left it. I left Surrey as soon as I left school, and now I'm thinking, well, there were good things about it, and I want to kind of revisit it and revisit my ways of thinking about Surrey. So I'm going through this Surrey Naturalist book and making a poem, either one line per page or a poem for each short chapter, depending on how it works out. This first one, these are cutouts using a little card cutout with a window in it that Lauren showed us earlier on. Man has to change to realize new lessons after the great change, and changes still to come. Little of modern life belonged in my mind. From the days of work, the meaning stopped. I looked beyond and stared out, far away, into a great black bowl. A crop, another crop, a heavy crop. Interference with the natural order. What once filled fields gradually vanished. The hungry soil was gone. The mind is all I believe to stay. Return, voices. And this one is another technique, blackout poems, where you just take out the words that you don't want. This was a short chapter, and I thought that was just going to give me maybe a line of poetry at the end, and I wanted an entire poem. So I just did the blackout, then I did it again and again, and built up layers which kind of interact, because I'm using some words in common and some different words in each line. I remember a warm orchard where a never before promise unfolded. I remember an empty orchard where an open promise looked quietly forgotten. I remember a different orchard where all I could promise were goblets of danger. I remember no other orchard beyond those fragile, thin threads of danger. All I remember of the orchard was a single promise, quietly bent and forgotten. And then I'm going to end up on this one, which is from the back of the book, where the author publishes some of his field notes in quite rough form, and I've just gone through those again in a sort of blackout form, picking out particular words and putting them together still in their original order. And this is his notes for January. Cooing, cooing, showing yellow, showing yellow, showing bloom, cooing glorious afterglow, showing yellow in full bloom, in full flower, lovely yellow, yellow sun, crocuses in full flower, gleam of sun on frozen snow. Okay, thanks.
Thanks so much, John. I'm so delighted you were able to join us and do a reading. I absolutely love the one about you know, the good artists, great artists. I think that's definitely a personal favorite. And I really love the bird names as well, especially the sound one. That was extremely interesting. But thank you for giving us so much context to the poems. I think it's really helpful to break that down, especially when we're talking about a workshop of, you know, how it was actually done and how it was put together. So I'll just follow now with one or two of my own found poems, and after that we're going to get straight into the writing exercise, so won't keep you too much longer. My first poem, I chose this one because it is about T.S. Eliot. So I went off the deep end reading about the T.S. Eliot and Emily Hale love letters that were put into Princeton Library for 50 or 60 years, and they were just opened in 2020 this year. So I started reading about that, and I got really interested in T.S. Eliot. I read some of his letters, I read some of his poems that were, you know, maybe love poems to Emily Hale, etc. So with all of this stuff whirring in my head and direct quotes from his letters and from his poems, I made an imaginary letter between him and Emily Hale, and I will spare you the long version. This is my 40 line for submission short version. So here we go. My dearest Emily, I wish your duties less so you would write me more. The spring weather here rushes with a force of life in lilac, blooming in the London squares. I observe, but I am disconnected, like Alice and the door, for which she is too small and later much too big. All that Alice can do is lie down and peep through. I have taken leave from Lloyd's, 3 months for emotional fever that seesaws depression and elation. After visiting Pound in Paris, I shall see the doctor in Lausanne to tend to that contained in the hollow round of my skull. I am grateful for the respite, for I have a long poem in mind and partly on paper, which I am wishful to finish. And on Margate sands, I could connect nothing with nothing. Instead, I sketch the people after a fashion and practice scales on the mandolin. My Emily of fire and violence. Since Harvard, I paid tribute, each poem to wonder, do I dare disturb the universe for decisions and revisions which a minute will reverse? I think of you always, Tom. And if you liked any lines in particularly in there, then they're straight from a T.S. Eliot poem, so don't credit them to me, but that's just an example. I suppose that would be just much like The Wasteland, that would be like an adapted found poem. So I kind of took his lines and then, you know, made this imaginary poem. I think it would be adapted anyway. Then the next one is from a Facebook group that I'm joined. The group is about telling the stories of mothers and fathers in Ireland who have faced difficulties during COVID. So you might not know this, but fathers have not been allowed into the hospitals, have not been allowed at like ultrasounds and stuff like that. And it's just led to a lot of difficulties for new mothers and fathers. And this group publishes first-person accounts, personal accounts from people, and there's so many of these stories. So what I did was I got 40 of these stories, and I just went through looking for I statements and pulled out all these I statements, and then arranged a poem of 40 lines, because, well, 40 lines and 40 weeks in pregnancy. But just remember when I'm reading through that each one of these I's is actually, it's a different person, it's a different voice. It's called You Hear the Cars Running at Night Trying to Stay Warm. I am a soon-to-be first-time father. I can't go with her. I started feeling contractions at midnight. I could barely drag my labor bag. I sat in the waiting room alone. I could see the anguish on his face. I tried to hold back the tears. I feel like my husband was robbed. I have never felt so alone. I didn't see him again for 5 days. I received devastating news. I stood crying in the corridor alone. I recently had an early pregnancy loss. I walked out to the car alone. I was miscarrying without my partner. I have never felt as vulnerable. I will never have another child. I wanted my mum there for support. I labored through the night on my own. I was rushed for an emergency C-section. I have never been more terrified. I still can't move and my baby is crying. I was left alone holding him while nodding off. I couldn't get my baby to latch on. I couldn't get a lactation consultant. I couldn't feed my baby. I tried desperately to express colostrum. I felt I had failed my baby. I protested. I consented. I needed help. I wasn't listened to. I was very afraid and alone. I would sit and cry in the bed. I couldn't believe how I was treated. I was trapped in that bed. I still have flashbacks and nightmares. I don't think I'll ever move past this. I lay in blood-stained sheets for 2 days. I will never forget it. And so that one would be an example of selected text. So I didn't do any additions. I only did subtractions, isolated all the statements, and then arranged them in that sort of literary collage. And then for my last one, which is probably my favorite found poems, and one of my first, as I was saying, I'm up in UCC studying the creative writing. Shout out to my homies in the room who are also up there. But there's some great graffiti anyway in the women's bathrooms. So what I did was I took photos of the graffiti and then I isolated it all into individual statements. So this would be another selected text one. I just kind of arranged these graffiti statements. It's called a Trina Voxe. Collage is lonely. Any League of Legends players? This is the sign you asked for. My parents think nothing is good enough. Up the rah! I'm 29 and in love with a woman. For the first time, I know who I am. Birds aren't real. Don't vote the same pricks back in on Feb 8th. I have an eating disorder. I just want to feel beautiful. Bird watchers everywhere are shook. Ross Mulcahy is hung like a horse. Repeal. My boyfriend says he loves me and I'm scared. I don't understand why he would. Any bags? My boyfriend says he loves me but would find me more sexually attractive if I was thinner. Love yourself first. You are yours. Tomato. Fuck him, then leave him. I broke up with him. Yay. I cheated on my boyfriend and now I'm pregnant. We are not retreating, just advancing in reverse. And the bullying continues in college. Any hash on tick? Any bags? I fuck up everything. YOLO, with a line through. You live every day, you only die once. Why can't my lonely ass find a decent man? Beyonce is ruining music. I might be pregnant and the fellows from Kerry, 50-50 as a leprechaun. Bullying is in your head, change your attitude. Nobody knows I'm trans, but I'm still terrified using the ladies. Coronavirus more dangerous than we're being told. I'm falling in love with my friend, but I can't tell her. This is your bathroom and anyone who thinks otherwise can feck off. Yes, you are. You are enough. Embrace your weirdness. Penis. I love Beyonce. So thank you. I love that one. Love reading the graffiti.
Yeah.
And then the very last one that I will do for you, sorry if I promised that was going to be the last, but we did this one at the start. So quickly, Facebook video about this guy, Italian graffiti artist, whose friend was killed by white supremacists. So his reaction was to go out into Italy and paint over hate speech on walls with beautiful murals of food. And he said this one thing in the video that really captured my imagination. Their hatred becomes part of my cuisine. So I used that line, that found line, and kind of made the poem around it. It's called Swastika Muffins. My Hitler is a cherry-topped muffin with purple iced swirls of anathema. Their hatred becomes part of my cuisine. In Verona, with Shakespeare's heroine, there's fresh sausage stuffed fat with swastika, and Hitler is a cherry-top muffin. bury bigotry in a sweet coffin, and flip murals with spray paint spatula. Their hatred becomes part of my cuisine. Mafia flag on brick, the origin of cheese-dripping margarita pizza. For dessert, Hitler cherry top muffin. Sauce recipe on the cross of Odin for supreme fresh vegetable pasta. Their hatred becomes part of my cuisine. The wall's battle scars heal like onion skin, layers of flavor to bake an idea that Hitler is a cherry-topped muffin and their hatred just part of my cuisine. Thank you all very much. And without further ado, I challenge you all to release yourself into your native environment and try and find some sort of found poem. You have 15 minutes, so it is 8:45 now. We will regroup. Margaret's ready with her cutout. We will regroup at 10. And if you wish to read out your poem at that point, we'll put your name in the chat. Everyone will get a turn. And then John is going to pick us a Just for Fun winner. And while we are waiting, I'm going to share my screen again and put up the prompts, the page of prompts, just in case you need some ideas for the challenge.